Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today as we have a community discussion on the impacts of COVID-19 on lactation support access and the experiences of marginalized communities. My name is Luz Sosa, pronouns she, her, hers, and I am the Office Manager and Programmatic Support Specialist for the Center for Women's and Gender Equity and for Stryker Institute for Leadership Development. I am excited to have the opportunity to moderate this panel session today. Please know that this panel session is being recorded to be viewed by others. A link will be provided to you following the event. As the Center for Women's and Gender Equity and Department of Nutrition and Dietetics have worked collaboratively over the past 9 years in developing, implementing, and maintaining a lactation support program at UNC, they also, like many other institutions, have been faced with addressing the impacts that COVID-19 has had on lactation support access. Today, we are joined by a group of individuals who have varying levels of lactation experience, both personally and or professionally, as well as a passion for serving and advocating for equitable lactation support access for marginalized communities. With us today are the following panelists. Yvette Lucero Wen is the Director for the Center for Women's and Gender Equity and the Stryker Institute for Leadership Development, and is the co-director of UNC's Lactation Support Program. Over the past 13 years, Yvette has focused her work on advocating for increased access and inclusivity throughout policy, services, support, and resources. Since COVID-19, she has worked diligently with her team to convert all services, support, and resources to meet COVID-19 guidelines while ensuring that equitable access be maintained. She enjoys every opportunity she gets to engage authentically with students as they seek to explore pieces of their identity and gain empowerment through their voices. In addition to her professional roles, Yvette's passion is also driven by her experience with motherhood and her desire to impact the world in ways that her children will get to benefit from. Dr. Alina Clark is a professor in the Department of Nutrition and Dietetics and the co-director of the Lactation Support Program at UNC. Dr. Clark's current research focuses on developing and evaluating programs that support lactating working parents. Dr. Clark is a registered dietitian, is involved in many organizations that advocate the need to promote healthy lifestyles for women, parents, children, and infants, and has worked in various settings, including hospitals, public health agencies, and academia. In her spare time, she loves to hike, camp, and raft with her daughter, dog, and husband. Kelsey Munn is a registered dietitian and international board certified lactation consultant with a specialty in maternal infant health and lactation. Kelsey currently works at Bellevue Women's Center, the Capital Region of New York's only inpatient facility dedicated to the care of women and infants. At Bellevue, Kelsey works as the community lactation consultant, where she assists with inpatient care, outpatient lactation consultations, organizing support groups, and education classes. Representing lactation on multiple internal and community boards and committees. And pre-COVID, attending conferences and expositions to market the hospital. Kelsey also works as NICU's registered dietitian, assisting and educating families on their infants' nutritional needs. Kelsey worked for New York State WIC for several years before moving into her current position at Bellevue. In Kelsey's spare time, she enjoys exploring the Northeast with her fiance, cuddling her senior dog, and frequenting local farmers markets. Jaleesa is an educator, doula, and holistic product maker, and currently the director of Ujamaa Residential College at Cornell University. She is passionate about making space and taking up space, especially for herself and those who hold marginalized identities. Jaleesa believes it is important for those who hold marginalized identities to share their truth and live in their authenticity. As Audre Lorde said, for those of us who were imprinted with fear like a faint line in the center of our foreheads, learning to be afraid with our mother's milk, for by this weapon, this illusion of some safety to be found, the heavy-footed hope to silence us. Living in our truth is what drives her doula business and intentionality while working with each mama she encounters. Jaleesa is now a first-time mama and is exclusively breastfeeding her daughter since birth. She is joining us today to share her narratives on their journey and how it has been impacted by the pandemic and racial tension in the nation. As we begin this panel discussion, I will introduce each panelist and share the question that each panelist was provided in addressing a topic that pertains to this discussion. After each panelist addresses their question, I will provide about 5 minutes for the panelists to address any questions that come in throughout their time they have been speaking. I invite each of our guests joining us today to submit questions you have, providing the name of the panelist you have a question for, and then the question using the chat feature. I will do my best to make sure each question or theme of similar questions will be addressed. We will then move on to the next panelist. After all the panelists have spoken, we will have an additional 10 minutes for questions and answers. We will be recording today's panel discussion, and the recording will be made available on our website for later viewing. Thank you, and now we will begin with our first panelist. Yvette Lucero Wen, as you have engaged in this work, focusing on ensuring that marginalized communities remain central in the work being done at UNC, who are some of the marginalized communities whose lactation experiences and access are being impacted by COVID-19?
Thank you, Luz, for that introduction and sharing of my question. So as Luz mentioned, I'm Yvette Lucero Wen, and I use the pronouns she, her, hers. And I'm excited that we get to engage in this conversation today, as many of us have not only witnessed the impact that COVID-19 has had on us personally, we have also become witness to how devastating this virus has impacted specific communities, more so our marginalized communities. I wanted to begin by just summarizing some national data on how we are seeing specific populations by race in particular be impacted by COVID-19 in order to help set up the context for which we will be discussing our lactation experiences, as well as support and resources today through our panel. So while the focus will be on race, I want to acknowledge that racial and ethnic minorities, or also this group is referred to people of color, are not the only individuals with a marginalized identity that are being impacted greater through COVID-19. We are also seeing communities who are marginalized through their gender, their sexuality, their class, ability, and the list goes on, who are also impacted in various ways. The Center for Disease Control, along with many others, have acknowledged having an awareness of how systems of privilege and marginalization have continued to create social and health inequities among our marginalized communities. These specific inequities have existed over a course of our history, and as our country has faced many events that have been caused by nature or natural or by humans, these inequities have taken on many different forms or have worsened the impact for marginalized communities. So for the purpose of today's discussion, I'm going to contextualize my thoughts shared today through the lens of race. So the CDC has been public in acknowledging that in their data collection, they have identified more significant impacts of COVID-19 cases, as well as hospitalizations due to COVID among our communities of color when compared to white or non-Hispanic populations. So currently, with over 8 million cases alone in the US, the CDC last reported that the American Indian or Alaska Natives and Hispanic or Latinos are reporting cases of COVID-19 at a rate that are 2.8 times higher than white non-Hispanics, and with Black or African Americans being 2.6 times higher. When it comes to hospitalizations, American Indians or Alaska Natives are being hospitalized for COVID-19 at a rate that is 5.3 times higher than white non-Hispanics, and for Black or African Americans, it is 4.7 times higher. And for Hispanic and Latinos, we're looking at 4.6 times higher. And when we look at deaths for COVID-19, our Black and African American population are dying from COVID-19 at a rate that is 2.1 times higher than our white non-Hispanics. And then for American Indian or Alaska Natives, it's 1.4 times higher. And for Hispanic or Latinos, it's 1.1 times higher. So with all of this data showing how much higher the rate of contracting COVID-19, dying from it, being hospitalized, we can see based on this evidence that racial and ethnic groups or communities of color are disproportionately impacted by COVID-19 at a greater risk and are at greater risk for getting sick or dying from COVID-19. So why is this the case for these communities? Specifically for communities of color, they have been and continue to be those who experience disparities when it comes to health and access to resources, especially in the midst of emergencies like pandemics. In the context of this particular pandemic, a few factors that have been shown to contribute to communities of color experiencing disparities that also play a role in increasing their risk of getting sick or dying from COVID-19 include things like discrimination, healthcare access, work, education, income, wealth gaps, as well as housing being impacted. So when we think about discrimination, these can be things like racism and sexism, which exist in systems that people navigate through housing and healthcare and jobs. So experiencing discrimination can result in toxic and chronic stress, as well as impact how people who hold marginalized identities navigate these systems. And during COVID, experiencing the impacts of discrimination increase the risk these communities get in contracting or dying from COVID-19. With regards to living environments, a good example would be residential housing segregation, which is a result of institutional racism and continues to lead people to living in more densely populated areas, making it difficult for them to practice the physical distancing and other preventative measures that are being recommended to people in order to reduce their risk. It's also evident that people of color are disproportionately, that they make up the essential workforce, working in farms and factories and grocery stores, public transportation, as well as healthcare facilities. Because these industries have a greater risk of exposure to COVID-19, folks are also not able to work from home or have paid sick leave. So this group is yet again at greater risk. And then lastly, because people of color are more likely also to be uninsured when compared to non-Hispanic white individuals, it limits access to healthcare in addition to lack of transportation, ability to get time off, language barriers, cultural differences, and historical and current forms of racial discrimination within our healthcare systems. So now when we think about how our communities of color are being impacted more greatly by COVID-19, and we discussed today how the experiences of lactation are being impacted, I want us to also remain aware that especially among our lactating population, the impact among our marginalized community of breastfeeders and chest feeders remain more greatly impacted by these additional factors that these communities have to continue to have to navigate. And so I ask that we continue to be mindful as we address these inequities that exist in the lactation experience and think about how these individuals are also marginalized in other identities. So thank you.
Thank you, Yvette. And we do have a question that came in. And the question is, what is another example of how another marginalized identity impacted by COVID-19?
That's a great question. And so as I mentioned earlier, how I kind of framed answering this question, I focused more on race because there's a lot more national data that's being provided specifically on that identity. But in other cases, the World Health Organization has also acknowledged that with regards to gender and that specific identity, that they are also very aware of how individuals, more specifically individuals who identify as women, are also being impacted greater through COVID-19. And why that is so is because the World Health Organization, I think, stated that about 70% of global healthcare workers identify as women. And so they make up 70% of that workforce and are usually the frontline workers in that situation. They also commonly, because of gender roles, also perform caregiving type tasks or responsibilities for families. And so they're expected to care for the family who are sick or children who may be sick, which also increases their exposure. So that's kind of another example of how, when we look at it through a lens of gender, how that particular identity is being who's marginalized is being impacted in a different way.
Thank you. Now we're going to move on and ask our other panelists a question. So this question is for Dr. Alina Clark. And the question is, as you have spent over 20 years focusing your clinical practice, research, and teaching on infant nutrition, what are the current national and international lactation and COVID-19 recommendations?
Great, well, thank you, Luz. That's a big question. And so what my goal is today is to share two current international and national guidelines, and then actually almost give a case study of how a nutrition guideline is bringing this all together. And I am going to show some slides here just to bring some of this information home. So bear with me 1 second here. And so when we're thinking about the CDC, the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, they did release guidance on breastfeeding during the COVID-19 pandemic. And one thing I do want to point out is that this is their term, breastfeeding. At our lactation support program, we would want to use more inclusive terminology such as breastfeeding and chest feeding. So you'll notice that even though the slide is saying breastfeeding, you will hear me oftentimes use the term breastfeeding and chest feeding because we want to be more inclusive. And this is a direct quote from the CDC. I'm not going to read it all, but basically the considerations are based upon the limited evidence. Please keep that word limited in your back pocket there. Available to date about the transmission of severe acute respiratory syndrome coronavirus 2. That's actually the virus, that causes COVID-19. Okay. So these are the current CDC recommendations. And I know Kelsey is going to be talking next about how this plays out more in a practical sense following these guidelines in a hospital setting. And so these are from June 2020. And also CDC is stating that breast milk or human milk is the best source of nutrition for most infants, and it provides protection against many illnesses. So right now they are recommending that a parent or a mother wears a mask, washes their hands before feeding or pumping. And if the parent is COVID-19 positive at birth, they do want you to strongly consider separating, either in a room 6 feet apart or in separate rooms. And you will notice that I underlined, this is not CDC, this is me. I underlined in the same room 6 feet apart because as a lactation professional, we do know and understand that it is very important to have that connection with that parent and that infant in those first few hours of life. And so in a separate room, you might not have that same connection. But if other people have questions about that, I know many of us on the panel would be more than happy to discuss that. And another thing that I do want to point out about the CDC recommendations is that there is no evidence for washing the breast or the chest before or after a feeding. Okay, so these are kind of the main points. But I would like to go further into three main points now before I talk about the World Health Organization. The first one is that this evidence has changed significantly since it first came out in March. And I think that's something that all of us probably have recognized with COVID-19. The recommendations, some have changed and been consistent. Others have not been as consistent because the evidence is changing. When the recommendations first came out in March in regards to lactation and supporting lactation, when they first came out, it was very prudent. It was very safety oriented, almost to the point where it almost appeared that they weren't recommending breastfeeding and human milk because CDC was fearful. We just didn't know, right? We did not know was there transmission. And then in a few other developments and iterations, it was more the parent should talk with their healthcare provider if this is something that they should do. And please note that I am not discouraging having communication with your healthcare provider. I think that's important. But I also feel that especially in any population, but in marginalized populations where maybe they don't feel like they have a voice, making it a guideline that they have to talk to their healthcare provider before lactating or breastfeeding or chest feeding, that could be a challenge or a barrier for lactation support. So I am thankful that in June 2020, the standards were a lot less prudent, but more based on better evidence and support, which is really great. The second thing, again, because my main area and role is in human milk and in breast milk, is this whole best source of nutrition. What is really interesting to note is that childhood obesity is being linked in rising significantly in the next year because of COVID-19. And this is kind of our case study here today. Experts are saying that it is going to rise. It is already higher than where we would like to see it. And it is going to be linked to a sedentary lifestyle as well as stress eating because of this pandemic, okay? But what we also know is that in a report from the Robert Wood Foundation, which is a major foundation that does a lot of public health research, we already know that childhood obesity is higher in communities of color and in communities below the federal poverty level, okay? So think about that for a second. Now, what I'd also like you to think about is that in some of the marginalized communities that we have been referring to today, they already have a higher risk, like Yvette said, of having obesity, of having heart disease, of having type 2 diabetes, because of all of the different items that she already went through and suggested, so I'm not going to repeat those. And then we also know that COVID-19 is one of the links of having more severe side effects is having heart disease, having type 2 diabetes, having all of these things, okay? So where am I going with this? I'm ending here, I promise. Where I'm going with this is that research has shown that breastfeeding, chest feeding, and offering human milk to an infant has been found to be a protective mechanism for childhood obesity. So the concern that I have is that if we're not supporting this, especially for everyone, especially in those in marginalized communities, we are doing a major disservice. I think it's also important for us to realize, and I do know that our two other panelists are going to touch on this, it's also important for us to have lactation consultants that do represent all identities, okay? And if you are interested in this area and you maybe would like to work with different communities, different cultures that are different than your own, understanding cultural humility, Knowing about your culture, understanding other cultures, practicing cultural humility, cultural intelligence is so important. So finally, what I'd like to end on today is this beautiful infographic from the World Health Organization. Now, I would like to add that, and I am actually working with some people with the World Health Organization, because I would like this to be a little bit more inclusive language. But what I'd like us all to focus on is some of these wonderful words. And I will say that the World Health Organization, because again, remember this is global, from a nutritional level, oftentimes the alternatives to human milk, you need safe water. And a lot of times we don't have that in some of these global communities, okay? Close contact and early exclusive breastfeeding helps a baby to thrive. A woman or parent with COVID-19 should be supported to breastfeed safely, hold her newborn skin to skin, and share a room with her baby. So those terms of close, thriving, support, safe, and hold, I think are so important, especially for anyone who is in a marginalized community and needs more support, especially now in COVID-19. Thank you.
Thank you. And we have a couple of questions coming in through the chat, but we're going to go over them kind of towards the end, just so we can stay on our timeline of like the time that we have for today. But one of the questions that we do have is, Dr. Alina Clark, as you and Yvette have been co-directing the lactation support initiatives on campus, can you and Yvette speak to how you have adapted UNC lactation support access during this time?
Absolutely. Go ahead, Yvette.
Okay, I was unmuting myself. I realized. So some of the things that Alina and I wanted to make sure and start working on as soon as our campus was starting to reopen at the beginning of our fall semesters, we wanted to start addressing all of our lactation stations on campus, making sure that they were going to meet the guidelines that have been established around sanitation and all those different pieces, distancing, and all of that. We wanted to make sure that individuals still felt somewhat comfortable, because we know that everybody has a level of discomfort at this point using public spaces for particular things, especially when we think about preparing food for infants, you know, for babies, right? We want to make sure that we're doing our best to provide a very sanitary space, especially during this pandemic. And so we worked with our facilities management to make sure that all of our stations would have sanitizing wipes available so individuals can wipe down their space before and after use in those spaces. I know that our facilities staff is also working diligently to make sure that all of our spaces are being adequately cleaned and deeply sanitized every single day. And so our common spaces that are located in our university center, our campus commons, those are being maintained by our facilities staff. And then also in our lactation stations that are located within departments and units, we've connected with those spaces, those individuals, to make sure that their spaces within their departments or units are also being monitored and cleaned, and that they're also using the proper guidelines for distancing and all of those pieces as well. And so those are some of the things that steps we've taken so far in order to make sure that we can continue to offer access to those lactation spaces throughout this time.
Yeah. And then two other things that Yvette and I have been working on. One is Yvette and I actually applied for a grant through the Colorado Breastfeeding Coalition to receive support and funding to start lactation support groups at UNC. When we applied for the funding, this was pre-pandemic, and we wanted to have them in person. We did receive the funding post-pandemic, and so we switched those quickly to virtual. A shout out to instructor and my colleague in the Department of Nutrition and Dietetics, Lisa Caldwell, who is leading those groups with us. So that is one thing that we are doing, and they've been quite successful. If anyone on this call is a UNC student, faculty, staff, or a support partner, and you were interested in that, please reach out to myself or Yvette. We'd love to have you join us. The other thing we have, like Yvette was saying, some people their comfort level is being shook during COVID. We do offer a privacy screen rental program where anyone can rent a screen. We say up to a year. It can be longer than a year. It's free. And your screen will be delivered to your cubicle or space. And it is cleaned and sanitized before and after. So those are a couple other things that we are also doing here at UNC to support our lactating parents at UNC.
Thank you. Our next question is for Kelsey Munn. And the question is, how have you seen your work and the ways in which you offer lactation support for breast and chest feeding clients been impacted by COVID-19? And how have you begun to address it? Through all the changes and adaptations that the hospitals have had to make through COVID-19, what would you consider to be the best change to come forward that will be kept after we no longer are in a pandemic?
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Luz. I have a PowerPoint as well that I would like to share with everyone so that you can see how the pandemic has changed lactation care and what we will continue to do post-pandemic as well. So before COVID became a thing, we were doing a lot of referrals within our community. My job started to work as a liaison between our community, between our lactation team, and between our education team. So we were already doing a lot of referrals to WIC, Head Start, Healthy Families, and our food pharmacy, which is a food bank run by dietetic interns in our area. We were doing education classes. We have several classes available, everything from breastfeeding to childbirth, pretty much everything in between. We were doing support groups at our hospital, along with supporting our baby cafes in the area, which were run by our Department of Health. And we were partaking in monthly, quarterly meetings to ensure that policy was being kept up to date to support families that were breast or chest feeding. We had just only started beginning to use social media before COVID had hit. So during COVID, a lot of changes have had to be made. Referrals became very difficult, especially for the first 3 to 4 months of the pandemic, because WIC was only doing things virtually or over the phone. Healthy Families was unable to make house calls at that time. Our food pharmacy was closed for quite a few months. We ended up doing a lot of educational support through a third-party organization because we were unable to educate our educators on how to use Zoom and telemedicine because we weren't allowed to see each other in person. And our virtual lactation support group became almost immediate. I think we only missed one day. It's every single Tuesday. So 1 week we missed before we were able to get that up and running right from the start. And then social media became a huge benefit for us. We got really into, with our marketing team and me for the hospital, the birth hospital, we got very large into Facebook, into Instagram, and our Bellevue Delivers, which is our webpage. We were able to revamp it and get more information on there as well. Our listserv is our monthly newsletter. It's called the Milk Memo, and we started that in February, and then this hit immediately after. So we've been able to use that listserv to support a lot of families and keep them up to date on changes. That is a free webinar or free newsletter. So if anyone wants to join that, all you have to do is email that lactation department at ellismedicine.org, and we can add you to that as well. Like I said, our support groups became virtual, our classes became virtual, but about 3 months ago now, we were able to restart them back up in person with changes. So everyone wears a mask. We have limits on how many bodies we can have in a room, which looks like 5 couples. Or if the infant is there as well, they can join us as a part of that coupled number. And that's just so that we can keep 6 feet in between every single person. Telemedicine became huge for us. We were doing support groups over telemedicine. We were doing outpatient consultations for the first 3 months via Zoom. And of course, keeping up to date with meetings as well within ourselves and in our community. Outpatient using telemedicine had some pros. Of course, we were able to get information and help our patients in a really stressful time by improving accessibility and availability. We were able to increase our attendance to make sure that we could get information and support to families via that support group. And of course, safety. Keeping our families safe is really important during this time. But it does have some cons, unfortunately. Telemedicine, it was really hard to figure out exactly what was going on with a latch. If we were seeing a breastfeeding or a chest feeding session over Zoom, and sometimes we would have support partners like holding a phone at very awkward angles, trying to figure out what was going on. You can't necessarily hear transfer of milk happening over virtual. And so we felt like it did lack that hands-on care. The other big thing is you cannot do a before and after weight. So breastfeeding a baby, weighing the baby and seeing how much they gain in grams can tell us how many milliliters they're getting from that feeding. And we weren't able to do that. So that was really difficult as well. And a big thing that we noticed is for our families that don't have access to Wi-Fi or live in areas that doesn't have good coverage in the first place. A lot of the times those consultations over telemedicine just ended up being like the chat box, texting each other back and forth because we couldn't hear each other and couldn't see each other because that wouldn't keep up with each other. In the hospital, it did change. Once you hit term during your pregnancy, you're tested every 5 days to give birth at our hospital in order to keep our staff healthy. And if positive but stable, families were not being separated. We were kept in the same labor and delivery room for your entire stay instead of being moved up to the postpartum floor. Your support partner was not able to leave that room. So meals were being delivered for both partners, and absolutely no visitors during that time as well. We didn't want extra people walking in and out of that room. And so we also unfortunately had to limit the medical professionals that could visit those families. Lactation was one of them that we did limit unless there was a complication happening. Then we could go into the room with full gear. But most of them we were able to do via Zoom, and I would send them an invitation and I would just talk to them through Zoom. If positive and not stable, that mother, if they needed to be transferred, would be moved to our ICU, which is at our mother hospital about 2 miles up the road. So it's a completely different hospital. Our infant would be transferred to an isolate in our NICU in the isolation room. And we were working with making sure that our care team at the ICU at our main campus could help families pump if the mother was unable to pump herself, especially if she had put in her birth plan and postpartum plan that she wanted to breastfeed. And then if negative, if mother or birth partner was negative in COVID, then really not a whole lot changed. Labor and postpartum care was very similar. The only thing that did change is visitors and support in the hospital. We only recently added a visitor that was allowed to come in between 4 and 8 p.m. And that one visitor is not a revolving door. It's one person that can come, and when they leave, you're done for the day. For the first almost 6 months of COVID, we did not have any visitors. So we had to get really creative with introducing new babies to family members through windows and making sure that they could meet older siblings and stuff like that. Doulas were never considered a visitor for us. For about, I want to say 2 or 3 weeks in the very beginning, we did not allow them just because we were so unsure. We did not know what was happening. But we decided that that is a necessary medical professional support partner in the birth process. And we wanted to make sure that the parents that were choosing to have them there had access to them. Of course, we had the midwife or the OBGYN that you choose at your birth. Lactation daily or as needed was allowed. And then we do have a social worker that comes room to room to make sure that we are getting referrals, access to care, talking about mental health during this time as well. So that was protected as well. Dr. Clark already talked a little bit about pumping and chest safety, chest feeding safety. So I won't go into this fully again, but we are, for our COVID positive families, they were making sure that they were washing hands and wearing a face mask during breastfeeding or chest feeding to make sure that they were keeping their infant safe. And then if we were expressing milk, again, washing parts, sanitizing pump parts, and sanitizing the bottle before the label was put on it was very important to educate our nursing team on, to make sure that you can't necessarily sanitize that paper label. So we were completely sanitizing the entire thing before that label was being stuck on. And then human milk safety, again, Dr. Clark addressed this as well. We know human milk has things in it that can keep our infants safe, and not just in that moment, but for years and years to come. So we know that IgA can show up and is detected in breast milk in most families, or in most people that have had COVID. It does show up in their breast milk, but the research that's being done on it right now shows us that it's a way to protect against it. It's not that you can get it through breast milk. So I think a lot of the times that was misunderstood in the beginning. This is some of our information at Bellevue Women's Center as well, along with my resources. So feel free to follow us on social media, or again, follow that newsletter if that's something you would be interested in. So I guess to summarize, my job has definitely changed for the better to support these families in this time through the change and adoption of telemedicine, virtual support groups, and education. And I think that we will definitely be keeping our virtual aspect of support groups and outpatient consultations with telemedicine as needed. We really prefer to have one-on-one in person for those outpatients, but being able to get help to someone that was feeling alone, and someone that was on the verge of giving up, and someone that had hit that wall was just priceless to us. So those are things that we're definitely looking at considering to keep as this hopefully ends.
Thank you so much for answering that question. And the questions are coming through, and we're just going to leave them towards the end. Right now, we're going to move on to ask this question to Jaleesa. The question is, during the lactation journey, many external factors tried to narrate the breastfeeding, chest feeding experience. In your experience as a breastfeeding person whose passion and other experience aligns with the liberation and empowerment of loving oneself, how do you narrate your own story, especially during COVID-19?
Ashe, give thanks. Hello, everyone. I am Jaleesa. My pronouns are she, her, hers. And that's a fantastic question. And I'm going to hit it in different parts. And feel free to always ask clarifying questions. I'm here for that as well. But I think what's most important, oh yes, and my daughter is here, so we both speak at the same time. So I will definitely do my best to elevate my voice so you can hear me, but she definitely has thoughts and opinions as well on our journey. So one of the things about like external factors for me are two big things, and that's support and representation. And that's what I mean by external factors. And so to start off, support, this can be from when you come from like the hospital, or rather just your birth team, because some folks don't have birth within the hospital. There's many different places and areas that have been practiced for centuries before hospitals were even established, where we gave birth. So that's important to know, but does that team support what you need and what you want when it comes to that? I know in my experience, I ended up being in the hospital, and it was really hard because I should note first is that I gave birth probably like a good 4 weeks before the pandemic had happened. And so, you know, my story is a little different when it comes to my experience and not having so much restriction within the hospital, but there still are restrictions. However, when I was there was only one lactation nurse throughout the whole time that I was there. And I was there for 3 nights, girl. And I was like, wow, like it was really hard because some nurses may have had ideas or thoughts of what it is to breastfeed or even their own personal narrative. However, when someone is trained to kind of know the in and outs of how to do something, that's totally different. And so I did find time of being in struggle, even with just language, when as soon as you have your child, like you don't produce breast milk right away. You don't produce human milk right away. There's definitely this beautiful mixture of vitamins and all these different things to keep yourself and your child safe that go into their body first. And those come out like, yeah, girl, and they come out in small amounts compared to your breast milk. So like I was aware, but wasn't aware. And some of the language was like, oh, you're not pumping enough. And I'm like, first of all, I shouldn't be pumping. Second of all, I'm not supposed to be pumping this much. Like my child isn't needing the breast milk and that's not what's coming out yet. So support is very important. And that's how you want to ask these questions as well when you're thinking about your birth team and their experiences. Also with support is your family and friends. Like, what does that look like? Do you have folks in your family who have nursed their child or has nursing experience? And why I say nursing experience, specifically for Indigenous and Black women, we were used to feed, especially white women's children throughout the plantation. And even when plantations were over, we were still chosen to breastfeed other mothers' children. So that's important to note, right? So it's like, do you have folks in your family and friends who are able to support you in that manner? I think that was really helpful for me. Like her great grandmother had 14 kids and about half of those kids were all breastfed. So like being able to hear her narrative and her stories, because I was like, how did you feel about pumping? She was like, girl, we ain't had no pump. And I was like, oh, okay. Like, and so it made me be able to ask some questions of like, do I really need a pump? Is this for me? And if it is, like, when is the opportunity for me to pump? So it's nice to have folks in your circle, as well as, you know, being able to not only have the knowledge of it, but can they take something off your plate? Yes, my dear. Yes, my dear. Can they take something off your plate for you? And sometimes that may be the burden of thinking about what you're going to eat for the day, or, you know, what type of nutrition you need, because when you are pregnant, your nutrition changes. And a lot of the ideas, and even myself had, was that I was going to go back to the way I was eating. Haha, that's not the case. You don't do that. You are pretty much at the same that you were pregnant, being sure that you're also feeding your body, because you're burning a large amount of calories when you're nursing. There'd be times I would be sweaty. I'm like, what is going on? And it was like, oh, like my lactation coach that I was able to get was like, oh, you're burning calories. I was like, I had no clue. I had no clue that this was all the effort that went into feeding my child from myself. As well as support is environment. And I think that's important. And it could be the environment in which where you call home, within that space of home, but also the town, city that you live in, your work environment, especially now. Like I always give people a heads up, like, hey, I'm gonna have my camera off because, you know, I have to feed, or, you know, and for folks who have fed, like sometimes we don't want to be dressed to the T, right? Like that's hard to like move these blouses, move this, undo this, just to like get to the source, which is like the breast, right? So I always do a good job of communicating, and I had to learn in my own narrative to not care. The most important thing that is happening right now is mine and my daughter's bonding through our nursing. And so if you feel some type of way because I have a job to maintain, and I had to feed my child, you could take that up to someone else because that's not me. And I would say that in my work, I have been really supported in knowing that like I am a mother and this is first. So I will say that my university, not only for myself, but other nursing parents on campus, I have seen the same support. You feel supported? I like that. Okay. And the other one is just representation. And that's also a big one for me because I'm always trying to search for things. So when I was trying to Google or just simply put in breastfeeding, that's something I want everyone who's watching to do. Just Google breastfeeding and you tell me what you see, right? Like, do you see people who look like me? Do you see, you know, even not only look like me, like the areola that I may or may not have, right? Like there's a conditioning that happens when we aren't being represented in all spaces. Like I shouldn't have to put Black breastfeeding to see maybe some pictures who look like me. So that was also really hard because when I was trying to ask advice, it's not only from Google, but even within my lactation coach, she had made a comment that was like, you know, your areola is a lot larger than mine, so your child's gonna have to work a little harder to eat. When that's false. Like that is false narrative, right? And that's how I'm working to really push to create my own narrative because it's just not fair. And there's so much stress that already happens with being a new parent that those things aren't needed. So for me, being able to have my own narrative is owning that space, right? Getting the support that I need, also finding the representation. Facebook has been a phenomenal place. I will drop later like where you can find me and I will shoot everyone information about the different mommy groups that I'm on, the different breastfeeding groups that I'm on via Facebook as well as Instagram. So those have been really great for me. So again, it's all about representation and support, and that's how I choose to create my own narrative. And the journey has been great so far now that I have taken time, and it has taken time. I'm postpartum almost 9 months now, and I would say about 5, it felt like a rhythm, maybe. Thanks, y'all.
Thank you. Jaleesa, one of the questions for you is, where do you find support?
Yeah, so one, not really locally in town. I'm actually the only doula of color in my whole entire town, which is obnoxious in 2020, I will say that. But we won't go there today. So it's more so as well as maybe the physical people that I've met through work have supported me, whether it was giving me advice before or after. As I just mentioned, Facebook is a big place for me. There are a lot of groups, which is nice too, because if you don't like the group, you just leave it. Like, it's like, you know what, this isn't matching my rhythm. And for me, I found like a holistic group. And that was important for me, especially for my spirituality. Like we've been doing this since life. Like, and I feel like sometimes when we give the narrative of having children and feeding, it's like, oh, this just happened not too long ago. Like, no, this has been happening since life, right? This is what we do. So that was a very powerful group because as well as, you know, Indigenous women, Black women, even within folks who came to the US during the plantation time and after, actually were our midwives, were our doula, our aunties, our grandmas were this. And, you know, now in times that vocab is changing and all this, it almost seems like these things have just appeared when they haven't. So a lot of my support is with other folks' narrative and also owning that space that like systems have set us up to think that this wasn't our space to begin with, when it actually has. And historically, that has shown, as an example I gave, when I know that folks, probably within my own family, were told to breastfeed other children that did not biologically belong to them.
Thank you. And thank you to our panelists for addressing some very important questions today. Now I would like to provide an opportunity for our panelists to respond to some questions we've had come in throughout the discussion. The first question I have here is for Dr. Alina Clark. And the question is, are there any effects on our population's nutrition status because of COVID-19?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And I honestly, yes, I'll just say yes. The short answer is yes. But I don't think we're going to see the true effects until next year. But one thing I will tell you is that food insecurity is at an all-time high here in the United States, and food insecurity has been linked to any nutritional issue, disease that we have known since the dawn of time. Okay. I will, however, say, and where we're seeing this the most is with children. And as someone whose career has been in infant and child nutrition, this is very concerning to me. We also have to remember that not only are parents and individuals losing their job, there might be having to take care of people at their home. Children are home from school, and most children, that's where they get most of their nutrition. For many children, especially children who participate in the free and reduced lunch program, they get breakfast, lunch there 5 days a week, and they're not getting that. Now, I will, however, say, thank goodness, our government actually is mandating that all children can have free school lunch. Some states also are doing breakfast for most places too, where you can go. But I will also say, sorry, I have lots of buts. Sorry, that's just the world that we live in right now. But you have to be able to have a parent or a caregiver that can physically drive you to the location that the free lunch is being held at. And so, Luz, yes, absolutely, we are seeing, and we're going to continue to see it. I think another big thing that goes hand in hand with nutrition is our activity level and mental health. We can't forget about that. I think all three of those things go together, and yeah, I'm so thankful for some things that we're finding with this, but nutrition is at a loss with COVID, and as a nutrition professional, we have a lot of work to do to help, especially with marginalized populations.
Thank you. This next question is for Kelsey Munn, and the question is, can individuals that did not birth at your hospital log into your virtual support groups?
Absolutely. Yeah. We have had actually really fun with our support groups. I've had several friends back in Colorado since I went to UNC who gave birth during COVID and did not receive help at all, similar to Jaleesa's situation as well. Did not receive lactation help at all while they were in the hospital. And so I had several people contact me seeing that I was advertising this on my personal social media, and they joined me, and we were able to get them over humps that they had no one else to turn to. So all of that information can be again found on our Facebook or our social media.
Thank you. We have a couple other questions in the chat, but I believe they've been answered throughout the panel. I don't see any other ones coming in.
Luz, if I can just make one comment regarding one of the questions. I think the CDC and the mask has been answered, but one of the questions from one of our participants is about, are certain races at risk for health disparities because of their genetics? I think we need to be really mindful and careful when we ask questions like that. I think back when I was in school, and I'm not going to share with you all what year that was, that is all we talked about. We talked about based on race and their genetics, they were at risk for a certain health disease. And what we are noticing now, and we should have noticed back then, that like Yvette mentioned, there are so many pieces to the puzzle that we can't just say it is genetics. It is health disparities. It's the whole gamut of what Yvette said. I think another thing that we have to play into is the nutrition, right? It is what we eat. And also we have to be very mindful that as nutrition educators, myself included and Kelsey, we have to be really careful that when we are trying to work with individuals from every single culture that we are working with, that we are mindful of their cultural foods and make sure that we include those in a healthy lifestyle, and don't forget about those, because those are so important to all of us. I love the food that I grew up with, and I don't want anyone telling me not to eat it. And so I think we have to be really mindful about that. So yes, maybe genetics, but I think it's a whole different bag. And I'm thankful that we are, I remember going to a presentation once that said, our risk for certain diseases is likely not based on race, but based on racism. And I think we all need to be mindful about that as a health professional and in the health world.
Thank you. I think we have another question coming through. And this question is for Jaleesa, and it says, what does your day-to-day look like?
Another great question. It just depends, honestly. And I think that's a part of me creating my own narrative. There's a lot of apps where you can time yourself and then time how long you feed. And it was good for me to use for about 2 weeks. Then after that, I had to cut it loose. I couldn't do it. It was too much stress because I was like, oh my gosh, you only ate for 10 minutes that time. And then this time you ate it's a lot. And for folks who have the experience, there's so much already happening in your mind. I didn't need that. So what my day-to-day looks like is going with the flow. Yeah, we go with the flow, huh? What do we do? So what we do is we get up, we do our thing, probably change. We co-bed or we co-sleep and share the same bed. So, and why I make it important to say both is because co-sleeping would mean that you would have another, you would kind of have a bed next to your bed. But for me and her, it works best for us to just sleep in the same bed. So when she gets hungry at night, she can just find me and I'm right there for her to eat. So, get up. She'll most likely eat as soon as she likes to wake up. And then I like to work out, and then I'll feed her probably again, either during the workout or after. She is starting to go on to solids. So I always try to feed her before we eat the solids and then after, just to do a little icing on the cake for whatever she ate. And so that's been really helpful. And then, of course, with work, we just do our thing. I feed on demand is the term. If you ever want to look up what I'm referencing, it's feeding on demand. So which means as soon as she indicates that she is hungry, I get to feeding, like right now. She's like, oh, Mom, it's time. So that's what I do and that's helpful for me. And it's also a privilege because I'm able to stay home and work from home. So she is with me all the time. So we're able to do that. My daughter is not one who takes a pacifier or a bottle. And it's not something where I was like, oh, I just don't want to. I tried. And she was looking at me like, girl, this ain't it. So for me, it is a little, can get a little much sometimes. I'm like, yeah, I wish you would just take the bottle right now. But she won't do it. So, but it's okay. Because I'm sure I'll look back when she's like 15 and I'm like, oh, I remember those moments. Right. So for me, that's what my day-to-day looks like. We go with the flow and we do our own thing for sure.
Thank you. And it looks like we don't have any other questions coming in. And we would like to thank all of you who were able to join us today. And remember, we will be sending out a link to today's recorded panel discussion. Thank you and have a nice afternoon.